Check, check, check. Check one. Check two. Okay. All right. Been a while. This is episode 55 of the 40 Ounce Hemlock podcast. This episode is part of a larger series that we're doing right now called Mind the Gap. It's called Mind the Gap because it is in several ways about several gaps that exist between what we know about the mind and what we know about the brain, and how that gap is hidden from the public view by academia and their messengers in the media. How that gap is hidden from the public view in order to purvey to the public that we know a lot more than we do. All right. And the reason that that is done is to push on the public a socio-political plan that is based on the false knowledge that the gap portends, or that the purveyors of the gap pretend to have. Okay? The gap is hidden. The gaps are hidden. There's a huge gap. There's an insurmountable gap between the brain and the mind. Okay? I've started to reveal that to you, and I'm gonna do it more. All right? There's an insurmountable gap, an uncrossable gap, what in philosophical circles they call an explanatory gap. It is as wide and deep as a gap can be. It will never be crossed. Okay? But the academics who poison our culture pretend as if this gap doesn't exist, and that when they look at the brain, they are learning things about the mind, and that looking at the brain is sufficient to know what you need to know about the mind. Okay? And they do this because they want to push on you a worldview in which you are to reconceive of yourself as simply a material being, and thus all your wants and needs are material in nature. Okay? At its bottom, this is atheism, but it doesn't come right out and call itself atheism. It dresses up in academic garb. At the level at which we're talking about it, it is meant to transform a culture into a socialist culture, a socialist society. Okay? Now, we're going to talk more about why that is the agenda, but that is the agenda. All right? I'm speaking to you from experience. I lived and moved in this world for a good portion of my adult life in academic philosophy, and I want to talk to you more about that today. Remember that we said that if you want to transform a society, you can either do it by force or not. But if you're not going to do it by force, you sort of have to get the society to transform itself. Okay, what is a society? It's just a bunch of individual persons. So if you want a society to transform itself, you have to get the individual persons to transform themselves. If you want to transform themselves, you have to get them to reconceive of what they are. They have to come to see themselves as something different than they have heretofore. Up to this point. Okay? That has been the mission of academia for as long as there's been academics, most notably and most concentratedly, if I can invent a word there, in the past 100 years, and especially in the period since Darwin. Okay? This is their goal. This is what they've been trying to do. This, if you understand it, and as we go, we'll slowly begin to explain everything to you. You'll notice in the last episode, I tied together these two seemingly disparate threads. On the one hand, the scientism that pervades our culture, and by scientism, I just mean the view that every single question that can possibly be asked, every single meaningful question that can possibly be asked or answered, is a question that can be answered by empirical science, by looking at the particles, so to speak. Right? these two disparate threads between the scientism that has pervaded our culture but is now fading, you'll notice, and the Marxism that is now rising. They are of the same, they are cut from the same cloth, okay? This is why, incidentally, I know some of the people that listen to me get into listening to Jordan Peterson too. It seems like we're saying a lot of the same things, though I don't mean to put myself on a level with him. I do think he actually has some gaps in what he has to say, and if I can keep going here, I would like to fill those out for you as I get a little bit better at doing this. He's got some blind spots, but the man's a genius, and he's right about almost everything. But this is why these two disparate threads actually being cut from the same cloth is why. So for instance, you'll watch like a Joe Rogan podcast with Jordan Peterson, right? And Jordan Peterson is talking about a lot of what we talked about in the series Unmasking Antifa. He's identifying all these academic trends and pseudo theories that really at their bottom are just Marxism, which is what my series Unmasking Antifa, among other things, was meant to show you. And then in a subsequent episode, Joe Rogan will have on someone like Bret Weinstein, right? Now, Bret Weinstein is seemingly superficially fighting against a lot of the same stuff that Jordan Peterson is fighting against, right? That people these days like to call it wokeism. Don't call it woke. It's just Marxism. Calling it woke, giving it a cute name, makes it cute. It excuses it. All right, just call it Marxism. That's what it is. But Bret Weinstein, cancel culture and all this. Bret Weinstein's fighting that stuff. But here's a little spoiler alert. He will not be able to defeat it, because at bottom, Bret Weinstein, or so it seems to me, is just another materialist evolutionist. He's kicking against the pricks of this transformation from the scientism to the Marxism because he likes the scientism, because he likes the empirical science, but he's never going to be able to fully get away from it, and it will swallow him up too, because the Marxism that is rising now is cut from the same metaphysical cloth as the scientism that we've all experienced for much of our, young adult and adult lives. Okay? I'm talking about, the Richard Dawkins, the Daniel Dennett's, all that stuff. Remember when it was fun? Remember when it was just like, YouTube comment section debates on Richard Dawkins videos? It's not like that anymore. Okay, we're moving towards something more cataclysmic. There is look, Tim Pool has said the Civil War is already here, and in a sense he's right, but there is civil war coming, because this outlook that is swallowing us up, it can't be made friends with, okay? You can't, it's total. It's a total view of everything, of all of nature, of all of reality, and thus man's place in it, and his nature, and his purpose, and all of that. So Bret Weinstein can fight against it a little bit, but he's not going to win. Because at the bottom of his argument is the same assumption that generates Marxism. Okay? If you want to transform a society, you have to transform the individual, and you don't want to do it by force. You have to transform the individuals in the society. To transform the individuals, you have to get them to reconceive of themselves, because an individual is just a self. Well, what is a self? That is the core question. What is it to be a self? Well, obviously, it's to have a mind, a self-conscious, self-reflective, purposeful, reflective mind, right? Okay? To be a self is to have a mind. Well, what is the mind? That is the question on which our society, and given our place in the world in America, perhaps, I don't want to get too eschatological on you, but that is the question on which everything is going to stand or fall. Because on one view, man is just this material thing, this accidental conglomeration, and this is where the evolutionists run in the room and go, it's not accidental, natural selection is like an algorithm. They don't know what they're talking about. Just bear with me. On one view, man is an accidental conglomeration of particles for no particular purpose. There was not intent behind the world he inhabits. There was not intent behind him. And thus, ultimately, there can be no true natures to things. To say that a thing has a nature is to say that there is a thing that makes it different in kind from everything else. Okay? But if we're all just material particles at the bottom, if it's all sameness at the bottom, then nothing is ultimately different in kind than anything else. Kinds, and thus natures or essences, and you can stick in a lot of different words here, are just superficial. They're surface level. They're a result of the varying behaviors of the sameness underneath. This is why, are you following? This is why all the culture wars, and we're reviewing a little bit here, all the culture wars, if you look really closely at them, resolve down into debates about natures. What's a baby? Is it a small human person made in the image of God with inviolable rights such that you cannot just kill it at your whim? Or is it just, ready, a clump of cells? What is its nature? See, a clump of cells. It doesn't have the nature of a person yet because natures are superficial. They're just something we foist onto reality. They're not part of reality. Same thing with the trans debates and the homosexual marriage. What's the nature of marriage? What's the nature of manhood? What's the nature of womanhood? All this stuff, all these debates resolve down into debates about whether natures exist or not. Whether things have natures. Okay? Now, the book of Genesis in the scriptures tell you exactly. Go ahead and laugh if you want. All right? Stick around. The book of Genesis in the scriptures, I might add the holy scriptures, because there's lots of scriptures out there, right? I'll just say scriptures, capital S. Tell you exactly how things got their natures. Okay? They were given them by the creator of the world. All right? Things are what they are and not something else. The whole story that Darwin tells is a story about natures being not intrinsic to reality. All reality is at bottom is a bunch of little balls bumping up against each other. All right? You see? And they just, and even David Hume before Darwin anticipated this. I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent here. We will be retreading this territory a lot. But you have to understand, the culture wars are a function, are a result, are intrinsically tied to this question about what is reality at its core. Is it all one sort of thing? Whatever you posit as the smallest thing, it's like protons or corpuscles or quarks or electron, right? It was subatomic, whatever, string, whatever. Is it all one sort of thing at bottom? Or is the world a purposeful construction of things that are intrinsically different from one another, given their natures by a creator, a fully self-conscious, fully intentional creator behind the world? Okay? Notice, and if it's the latter, notice what that means. That means you will never, they like to talk about the God of the gaps. I'm getting off track here. But listen, if you understand this insult they throw around about God of the gaps, notice that if that's what the world is, this latter thing, you will never get to the ultimate explanation of why a thing is what it is without citing some reference to that creator. I'm going to talk in just a little bit about software development and computer programming. And I'm going to use an example, an analogy from that to help you understand this. All right? If you want to change a society, you got to change and you don't want to use guns, although now they're arming up, aren't they? The IRS is arming up. The Social Security Department's arming up. They're all arming up. They're all buying. I can't buy my 9mm rounds at Farm and Fleet because they're buying them all. All right? Why are they doing that? Well, maybe they think that this plan isn't going so smoothly. Maybe there's some resistance. If you want to change a society, you got to change the individuals. If you want to change the individual, and again, if you don't want to do it with force, if you want to change the individuals without force, you got to get the individuals to change themselves. If you want individuals to change themselves, you have to get them to reconceive of what they themselves are. To do that, you have to give them a new explanation to work with of what a self is. That is the purpose that Darwin serves, ultimately. I know you think it's a story about how animals be. It's not. It's not. Okay. So the way that academia has pushed this transformation on us is by way of a certain story that I've talked at length about in the opening episodes of this series, aside from the very first episode, which was like that little excursion on polarization. Which, I spent like a half hour trying to give this clever Baskin-Robbins analogy, and then Elon Musk comes out with that little one picture tweet that like said everything I was trying to say in that Baskin-Robbins 31 flavors analogy. Oh well, I'm not the good on him. It was a great meme, great tweet. If you know what I'm talking about and you listen to the first episode of this series, then you know what I'm talking about. All right, so the way that they've done this, the way that they've planned to do this, the way that they've largely been successful in doing this, in getting us to reconceive of ourselves, is by pushing on us a certain version of intellectual history. Okay? Now this is why, notice me, you're like, well, not all of us know this. Right. Look at the gap. Here's another gap. Look at the gap between the way people who have been raised in the sort of like university environment, the intellectual environment in our culture, versus the people who haven't. This is often explained into, it's often cited in terms of like disparaging the people who don't have college degrees or don't work white collar jobs or don't live on the coasts right. Listen, look at the disparity between these two groups. And notice how it maps onto the red state, blue state thing. Look at the disparity between these two groups in how they lean politically. Well, like we've said before, there's levels to this. They lean the way they do politically because of the way they lean culturally. The way they lean the way they do culturally is because of the way they've been educated. The way they've been educated is with this story. All right? And I've said a million times, the story is flat out false. Okay? Do I need to rehearse the story here? I will do it in 25 words or less. Here's the story that they will tell you if you go get a 4-year liberal arts degree in a college in America today, or and elsewhere as well. But I'm focused on this country because we're the last bastion. Okay? If the world's gonna be saved, it's gonna be here. Okay? Here's the story. Back when man was ignorant and didn't know anything about the world, he thought the world was made of lots of different sorts of things, and that he himself was made of at least two different sorts of things. In philosophy, this is called dualism. Dual, like two, okay? D-U-A-L. He used to think that he was mind and body, or flesh and spirit, or material and immaterial. This was the sort of mythical, naive, religious, ignorant way of looking at things. But then on into the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, we got really smart with the scientific revolution. And we realized how to have real knowledge. And we learned then, after we realized that, the MVP of that old view, René Descartes, after he put forward his best philosophical argument supporting that view, and we defeated it, so goes the story. And we realized that if Descartes was wrong, then there was no reason to believe this view of man having two components to his being. Pardon me while I stretch. We realized that through the scientific revolution, through proving Descartes wrong, etc., we realized that was all false, and man is really just a material being. All right? And then we really started to have that's when the world really picked up pace and progress started to be made, the scientific revolution and all that. So we're not just building like cotton, machinery and factories and stuff and like making advances in bio. No, it's us. We learn more about us too. We're material just like everything else. Okay? But we weren't quite sure, if that was the case, where we came from. Because in addition, if you go back to Descartes, right? Descartes was a philosopher, but he was a religious man. And so he was trying to give strictly philosophical arguments for the view that religious people, right, primarily Christendom, had held throughout history. He was trying to give philosophical expression to that. And we know that he was wrong, says the story, right? Because we came up with this argument that showed that his view was impossible. We'll talk more about what that is in just a second. But then we had to figure out, well, okay, well then if the religious view of the world is wrong and science shows that, it doesn't, but this is the story, well then what are we going to say about where we came from? Because we need over there they had an origin story. We got to have an origin story too. And then came Darwin. And Darwin supplied the origin story. Man is just this amoeba. He's just this conglomeration. He's just this accident. He's just this thing that just rose up out of the protoplasm, out of the mud, out of the, right? He's accidental. There is no intent. There is no mind behind the world, because mind itself is a result of the material interactions in the world, not a thing behind the world that created the world and created little instances of more minds called you and me, and gave them life and gave them rights and gave them, right? No, that's not what man is. Man and everything else is just an accident. Stuff bumping up against other stuff, combining and decombining in various ways. All right, so this is the story. Man used to be ignorant, and the fullest expression of that mythical religious view that man had of himself came about towards like the beginning of the scientific revolution with René Descartes, but there was an obvious problem with what Descartes said, and we saw it and we moved on, but then we had to figure out where we came from. Then came Darwin, and now we know everything. And Trump's an idiot. You see? That's the story. You might be wondering about that last part. If you listen long enough, you're going to see how all this stuff ties together. This podcast started with a series called From Darwin to Donald Trump, and actually, really, almost every episode thence therefrom has really just been a variation on that theme. It's very important. We live in very interesting times. All right, so I've been promising that we are going to do in this series at some point two things. We're going to look at this clip that I think perfectly exemplifies so many aspects of this story at work in our modern media culture. And then I also said that we were going to do a deep dive into some of the arguments that show that this story that everyone in the media believes, because they grew up in this academic system and they're all just little drones and they don't know how to they're just repeaters. They're just chicken heads, bobbleheads, whatever you want, right? I said we're going to do two things. We're going to look at a clip that exemplifies that sort of them in action, and this story operating in action, right, in what they do and how they talk to you, because it's you that they're concerned with. It's you they're trying to change. You got to understand this. It's not Donald Trump. You're the target. You're the mark. Okay? It's really interesting to be doing this episode now after Joe Biden's speech, where half of America was essentially turned into terrorists. Listen, all of this has been in the works for a long time, and you will hear what Joe Biden said the other night. It's awful, but it's been hinted at by the left for years and years if you've been paying attention. And it all stems from this phenomenon I'm trying to lay out for you and describe to you. Okay? Been promising we're going to do two things as the series moves on into its second half. The one, again, was a review of this clip, but the other was going to be a deep dive into the arguments that show that this story is flatly, absurdly, fatally false. Okay? And I think the best way to do that is to start with the arguments so that you know, when we go into this clip, you know how much the hosts and the people on this panel he's talking to don't know. And you can see how ridiculous what they're saying is in light of the bit of argumentation, the little bit of philosophy I'm going to give to you in this next episode or two that shows that this story is complete fiction, that we do not know what we think we know. Okay? And now I've gestured at this, I've hinted at it. I know both in the original series From Darwin to Donald Trump, and again in an earlier installment of this series, an earlier episode of this series, I've talked about this sort of like gap between the academics, where you have some academics who are pushing this nonsense, and then you have this other interesting group that are of the same persuasion metaphysically. You know, they're atheists, they're materialists, they're right, but they won't take the further step in certainty that their colleagues take. Like, they will actually display some intellectual honesty, and they'll be like, no, look, I want this to be true. I want this to be true too, but we don't know the stuff that they're saying we know. So there is this occasional ray of light amongst them where they will admit that they're bullshitting you, or that their colleagues are bullshitting you. So I've cited people like that a few times. Think of like William Lycan, that quote from William Lycan, where he's like, look, I'm an atheist, I'm a naturalist, I'm a materialist too. And he's like a philosopher of mind par excellence, right? University of North Carolina, you know, super respected philosopher of mind. But he calls his colleagues to the carpet. Is that the expression? Calls them to the carpet? Calls them to the mat? I don't know. Sorry, it's like 6 a.m. And he says, look, they're lying. We don't have arguments that show that this has got to be true. And we don't really have arguments showing that the old view, the Descartes view, mind, body, immaterial, material, right? We don't even have arguments that show that that's false. Uh-oh. Right? So there's this occasional beam of light that shines through with these guys. All right? And I've tried to bring that out and point you to it. But I want to give you the actual light here, not just like, you know, not just like some chirping from some members of the opposition, some dissenting chirping from members of the opposition. I want you to see these arguments. I want you to see to the bottom of the issue. And then once you do, and then when these people try to push this nonsense on you about what we've learned about us and our place in the world and what evolution has taught us and what the mind is and what, and now look what this extends to. This extends all the way to, like, think of the other story you've been told about the two different political parties in our country, right? What is it? It's that one is like entirely faithful to science and only forms its views on the basis of science and what's publicly observable and knowable, and the other one is based in this like old world mythical, you know, faith-based approach to reality, where they make use of science where it's useful, but then they base a bunch of their other views on faith, and then they push those on you, and that's fascism, right? It's all false. It's all false. What you will find is that, well, you'll see. It's not true. It's not true. And when we get to the bottom of some of these arguments about the mind and the brain, you will see that they don't know anything about it. Okay? And that therefore, and for that reason and several others, their view is saturated in faith-based claims. Okay? And I'm getting ahead of myself. I told you it's like, what is it, like the third or fourth series now, but it's all really it's all the same thread. Anyways, I'm going to talk about the falsity of the story now, and I'm going to do a little deep dive, and I'm going to talk about the falsity of the story by way of a true story from my graduate school days. Okay? I had the chance to study under and TA for a professor who worked in the philosophy of religion, philosophy of mind at a major university, who was an emeritus professor at the time that I was going to be getting started on my dissertation. And great, really nice guy, really technical philosopher, really great guy, but he was teaching a class on philosophy of religion, and because philosophy of religion is so inextricably bound up to theories about what the mind is, because theories about what the mind is are bound up with what human nature is, and obviously that crosses over into a religious question. Are we the thing that Darwin said we are, or are we the thing that Genesis says we are? All right. So we were working through, over the course of this semester with he and his students, all these different materialistic theories of mind. Okay, and that's where my story begins. This is a little story, a true story about the falsity of the story. All right. All right, so here's the story. Here's the true story about the false story. I guess it's not necessarily imperative to put this in the form of a narrative, but it sort of touches on a kind of comment I made a little bit ago about, remember when the culture wars weren't life and death, or it didn't seem like it was yet, right? Before the Cold War turned hot, before the culture war became a civil war. Remember when it was just arguing with atheists? It kind of touches on that a little bit. Okay, so listen, I'm a graduate student studying philosophy of mind and philosophy of religion, philosophy of science. Pursuing my doctorate. I'm studying under this gentleman who's pretty big in philosophy of religion, does a lot of work also in philosophy of mind, epistemology, and things like that. Old guy, real old. Probably definitely the only religious guy in the department. I naturally gravitated towards him. But he comes from this school of philosophy that another very notable person that we'll probably talk about pretty soon in analytic philosophy comes from. And if you know that world, you know that people that come from this school of thought are really rigorous and difficult to read and understand to the uninitiated. I don't want to get too deep into this and make it too deep, but listen, it's this guy's doing hardcore fucking philosophy, all right? He can have he'll be working through a paper and he'll spell out what seems at first glance the same proposition 10 different ways, but there's only subtle changes on it that have radical difference or radical consequences for the meaning of the thing and whether the argument goes through or not. And you got to hold all these variations on the proposition in mind, and it's and sometimes you look at these papers and they look more like a math textbook than they do a piece of writing, because there's so much symbolic notation and all this stuff. It's called analytic philosophy. I don't want to go into it at length here, but this is just to say that this professor came from that school, literally that school where that form of philosophy kind of really took off. I mean, it's been in the English speaking world in England and America, it's been sort of the standard thing, but the school, the milieu that this guy came from, they really took it to the next level. Anyways, I'm TAing for this guy, and he's old, okay? And was it a philosophy of mind course or philosophy of religion course? Now I'm having trouble remembering whether it was a philosophy of religion course in which we just did a quarter-long thing on philosophy of mind because it's so relevant. I think that's the case. Okay, so anyways, over the course of the quarter, this unit that we were in, he had been taking the students through all these different, extremely tough to wrap your head around, no pun intended, theories of mind that had arisen ever since people decided that Descartes was wrong and the mind could not be a different thing than material. It had to be material itself. It had to be the brain, right? All these different theories of how the mind worked or what it could be, given that it is the brain. When we look at the brain, we're looking at the mind. That's what putting Descartes to bed or disregarding Descartes or letting Descartes die or that's what being done with Descartes and embracing Darwin does. Okay? Remember our story. The way you're told the story when you study philosophy in college, or even if you take a modern philosophy 101, right? You're told, yeah, Descartes was this religious guy and he was really just trying to give rational arguments for a view that he was already committed to by faith. And so you can sort of see the places where he kind of leaps the logic and just inserts faith, right? And we're not going to do that. And we found this fatal problem with what he says about the mind. And so we don't believe the mind is different than the brain. because Descartes' argument was not compelling for the reason I'm about to show you. Well, we talked about it before. It's called the interaction problem, right? After all, if material and immaterial, or flesh and spirit, or body and mind are totally unlike each other, like Descartes is famous for saying, yeah, like material is the kind of thing you can measure and knock on, and it has extension and space. It takes up space, right? You can imagine it being cut in half infinitely, right? It's separable, right? He's like, mind is nothing like that. Nothing like that. It doesn't have extension in space. You can't imagine it being partitioned like half. Like, well, I know we have that expression, right? I've got half a mind, but that doesn't really make any sense. There's either mind or there's not, right? So Descartes was like, these two things are nothing alike. And they have nothing in common. They have no, in the way he put it, was they have no properties in common. And two things that have no properties in common are not the same thing. And then his critics came along and they're like, yeah, and two things that have no properties in common cannot interact. I'm going to now choose to pick up my coffee. Look at that. My mind just interacted with my body. My mind made a decision based on a felt feeling of thirst or a desire for another jolt of caffeine. My mind made a decision which caused my body to reach out and grab the coffee. And they're like, Descartes, if mind has no point of contact with body, why does it have no point of contact? It has no point of contact because to have a point of contact, you would have to have something in common. One billiard ball on the pool table, one pool ball, right? Why do we still say billiard ball when nobody, who plays billiards now? One billiard ball can only hit another billiard ball because they are both things in space-time with mass and extension, right? And so they can't occupy the same, right? They have properties in common. Lots of them, right? Physical objects with mass and density, right? But Descartes was like, mind and body have nothing in common. So Hobbes comes along and some other guys comes along. Incidentally, Hobbes is a materialist who, never mind, I'm not going to do that right now. Descartes' critics coming along and they're like, well, if they have nothing in common, Descartes, then they can't interact. Sorry, mind's got to be the brain. Okay, that's the interaction problem. And when you go to college, you are taught that spells the end of the faith-based religious way, and I don't buy any of that shit. I'm not saying it's a faith-based religious way of looking at the world. I'm saying that's what you'll be told. All right? They're saying that interaction problem, the way they will teach you, your professors will pound this into your head. That interaction problem spells the end of the religious or faith-based, the God way of looking at the world being rational. They're like, there's no more, you're not rational if you look at the world that way after appreciating this problem. No, the mind is the brain. And then, right? Because the religious person has a place for man in the world and the story of where he comes from. So these folks disregard that. They put it to bed and then they're like, oh, but now we need a story like that. And then Darwin comes along. And they're like, yeah, that's our story for how all this came to be. Oh, and it fits with what we're saying about the mind, because the mind of man is just this brain that, evolved like everything. It's a material thing and a material head and bone is part of the organism. It just evolved like everything else. So after they do that, then there's this whole century plus of trying to come up with a theory of how that thing could be what they're saying it is. Does that make sense? And they come up with all these different theories of mind. Like right when Darwin wrote, they weren't too concerned with it. They're like, yeah, well, this must be, right? Darwin says a little bit about the mind, and I'll have more to say about what Darwin says about the mind in the next episode. But right when Darwin writes, there's not a lot said about the mind, but then some of Darwin's most poignant critics, I did a 50-page paper on this one guy right as I was leaving school. Some of Darwin's most pointed critics fixated on the mental aspect of what Darwin was saying and gave very powerful arguments. And you'll never hear them because everyone believes the story and doesn't want to hear anything that disrupts the story. Okay? Mind cannot evolve. It did not evolve. It's not the brain. Spoiler alert. But hold on. So in this quarter of this semester, in this class, studying under this professor, he had been working the students through lecture after lecture, week after week, all these different theories that philosophers and scientists have tried to give, and philosophers of science and philosophers of mind, it's all a thing. They're all one thing. Yeah. Have been trying to give to explain how it is that the brain could be the mind and the mind could be the brain. Okay? There's all these theories. There's anomalous monism, there's identity theory, there's type identity theory, token identity theory, epiphenomenalism. There's all these crazy sounding, there's all these different theories, because it's not enough to just say, yeah, the mind's the brain. You got to then give an account, as the philosophers say, a theory about how there's functionalism, a theory about how it works. Okay? How the things that we know the mind is and does, because we have them, could be carried out by this squishy gray thing that we're looking at called the brain. So there's this litany of theories that roll out over the course of the 20th century. I call this the 100-year fail, because every one of them fails. But the students in this class were having a really hard time wrapping their head around the technicality of these theories, because they're like freshmen, sophomores in college taking an introduction to philosophy religion class, and here's this analytic professor walking them through the various arguments for and against type identity theory and functionalism and trying to explain the utterly counterintuitive epiphenomenalism to them, and they were lost. Okay, and I'm the TA in this class, and this is my, I was about to say this is my passion, or what, can you tell? They're lost. I could tell they're lost, and I have them on Fridays for discussion group, but he has them on Monday and Wednesday and Friday for lecture, right? So this was an emeritus professor, he's old, and towards the end of the quarter, he fell ill. And on like Sunday night or Monday morning, I forget which, I got a call or a text or an email. I forget it. This is a while back. I got an email from him saying, it was either him or his wife. No, it was him. Saying, I'm in the hospital and I've got these random nosebleeds. I'm like, eesh. Don't know why, don't know what's going on. So whatever you want to do tomorrow, students are going to be in the classroom at 10:30, right? Whatever you want to do, right? And I'm a TA, but at this point I actually have quite a bit of teaching experience. So it wasn't like a daunting thing to imagine, teaching subbing in for a lecture, but I didn't have anything prepared, right? So I was like, okay, all right. So Monday came, and we all assembled in class, and I sort of broke the news to them about what was going on with him. And I was like, look, I get this feeling that what we're doing right now is really hard and confusing, and you're hanging on by a thread. And it's okay because it's super technical. And I said, I feel like there's some things that if you understood them would make all of this make a lot more sense. So let's just start from the beginning again, and I'm going to try to give you, I said to them, what the sort of motive is first for these theories. Because if you just look at the theories themselves, you're kind of like, what? But if you first understand what they were trying to do because of this progression from rejecting Descartes to embracing Darwin to then saying, well, since we've embraced Darwin, now we've got to give some theory about how the brain could be the mind, then you could kind of see where some of these theories are like, what? People were inclined to accept them because they had already committed themselves to this materialism. The brain is the mind is the brain, right? Because they had to reject Descartes because of the interaction problem. I said, let's just walk back through each of these after we do a little bit of backdrop so you can see this progression, and we'll just thumbnail these theories again for you. Because he's been going on, and they're trying to follow. He's getting really deep in the weeds with these theories. So I just want to do another skim across the top with them. And that ended up taking up Monday's lecture and Wednesday's lecture. Just kind of did these spontaneous lectures where we just kind of walked back through the theories and gave them sort of the thumbnail, the high level, the 30,000 foot, right? They say in business. And I said, but here's why I'm going to do it. Or here's the payoff. I said, I don't know how long our professor's going to be ill, but we got Friday coming up. I'm going to keep going with this. And at the end, we're going to go all the way back to Descartes. And I'm going to show you that none of this was ever necessary in the first place. So you don't be worried about not understanding it and the theories sounding wacky, because they are bullshit, because none of it was ever necessary in the first place. All right? I mean, I didn't say that. Maybe I said something along those lines. And I said, remember the interaction problem. We were taught, and you're being taught, you will continue to be taught, that Descartes was just, and I'm no apologist. I'm not like some apologist. I didn't think Descartes was like the answer to all. It's not like Descartes that important, okay? It's just that he kind of represents this turning point in the story that they try to tell you, okay? So, sorry. And that story, again, is that he was a religious guy. This is the key thing. He was acting like a philosopher, but at points in his argument, he was being religious, and he was hanging his certain premises on faith rather than reason, right? So they reject him because they're all about rationality and faith and reason. Well, you don't know how science works, all right? It's total bullshit. And I told my students, my professor students, they're my students too, I said, I'm going to show you this, and the fucking scales are going to fall off your eyes, okay? You're not, and it's not going to be hard, like all this stuff we've been doing up to this point. This is super easy to see. So you're going to see that not only was the reason for rejecting Descartes nonsense, it's that they then turn around and do the exact thing that they're accusing Descartes of doing in the interaction problem, which made everybody atheists, supposedly. It didn't. Nobody's really an atheist, but just go with it for a second, right? I said, you're going to see that. I'm going to show you that. Super simple terms. This does not have to be hard, okay? And then I said, I'm going to do the thing that I'm going to do here too. In the next step, this deep dive is going to be two episodes, 2 arguments long. This is the first one, okay? And then we'll get to the clip. I said, and then I'm going to show you that all these theories that we've been spinning out, or all that they spun out, that we're trying to track along with, the type identity theory, token identity theory, epiphenomenalism, functionalism, all this crap, it will never work. There's a gap. Mind is the gap. It will never work. They're impossible. It is impossible to make what we know the human mind to be out of material. Okay? Can't do it. I said, I'm going to show you that. But first, I want to show you why what they accused Descartes of, inserting faith into his argument and thus his interaction problem. Let me just be clear about why they're saying Descartes inserted faith into his argument. Go back to the interaction problem. How can an immaterial thing cause a material thing to do something? How can a thing which takes up no space, has no mass, has none of the properties of materiality, how can it act on something that does have the properties of materiality because it's material, right? How could they interact? That's why it's called the interaction problem. And so when I say they're accusing Descartes of inserting faith into his argument, because essentially Descartes has to say, well, it just does, right? It's that move. It just does. I guess it does. That's not an explanation. So insofar as that's what Descartes is saying, then they're like, whoa. You're not being rational. We have to have reasons for why things do what they do, right? There's a reason I'm scoffing like they usually do. Just, you're going to see this in a second. And you're going to be like, what? Listen. So that's the sense in which they're accusing Descartes. They're issuing Descartes an ultimatum. They're saying, Descartes, you can't explain this one thing that your theory requires as explanation. Requires an explanation for. So you can either abandon your theory and come with us, right, in materialism, or you can just accept the label of not being rational and inserting faith into your argument, right? Which defeats the whole purpose of Descartes' project, right? Because Descartes' project, what was Descartes' project? Sorry, headphones. What was Descartes' project? From the beginning, Descartes' project was to give philosophical, rational expression to the things he already believed on the basis of revelation and faith and things like that. He was a churchman, right? In the old Catholic sense, in the scholastic sense. So that's the ultimatum for Descartes. And okay, so hang on one second. So I told our students, I said, I'm going to show you not only that is the interaction problem no problem at all. Like, it's not a problem. But I'm going to show you, relatedly, that the very thing that they are accusing him of in the interaction problem is something they themselves are guilty of in the very nature of the position that they then want to take. And then I said, to boot, like the cherry on top, I'm going to show you why no materialistic theory of mind can ever work. Are we good? You're like, all right. So we did this over the course of 3 days. And on the last day, I said this. I'm going to get to the second part, why no materialistic theory of mind can ever work. We'll do that in the next episode. This is kind of like the 2-part deep dive. And there's more arguments. Listen, I've been saying this for like 5 episodes. We're going to do a deep dive of all the arguments. We're not. I got plenty of podcasts coming. I'm just going to give you these 2. I'm going to show you why rejecting Descartes, as people historically did, as the story tells you, the whole thinking world did, makes no sense. Because all the materialistic philosophers, all the materialistic theorists of mind then turn around and do the very thing that they were accusing Descartes of doing, and thus embrace faith in their argumentation. Or here's what they call it. Here's what they call it. In philosophical circles and intellectual circles, they call them, it's called, I know you might have heard this word in terms of like black magic and stuff. It's called occultism, O-C-C-U-L-T. They call these occult properties. Occult means magical, mystical, inexplicable, okay? So they're like, we can't have any occult properties in our theory of mind. It all has to be scientific, right? Okay? It all has to be empirical. It has to be things that can be seen and touched and measured, right? Yeah, it's half gone. Can you tell? Usually I have a beer. And I've got a coffee. And you could there's a definite effect on the tenor of the thing. Where was I? So this is going to be a 2-argument deep dive. First, I'm going to show you what I showed my students in that our students, his students, whatever, in that class. Okay? And then the next episode, I'm going to show you why you don't have to worry about working through a semester or a quarter or a year or a graduate degree of studying all these materialistic theories of mind, because not a one of them can work. And once you understand that not a one of them can work, you're going to understand that naturalism can't work. And once you understand that naturalism can't work, you're going to watch a clip like we're going to watch in the next episode and wonder how all these people that pretend to be so intelligent and manipulate you and are pushing you towards socialism can operate in such a way that naturalism is at the foundation of all their arguments. It is. Okay? It is. That's where we're going. You see? Stick with me. I know I take a long time. I got a lot of shit going on in my life. I know I take a long time. Please follow this. It's very freeing. There's nothing like learning that you can say, fuck you, to something you've really felt needs to be said, fuck you to, your entire... You know what I mean? It's freeing when you find out it's okay to do that. And this is the paradigm that you have been oppressed. You've been oppressed with Darwin. You've been oppressed with naturalism. You've been oppressed with materialism. And some of these guys are the Jordan Petersons of the world, and there's not many like him, right? They're so close to the truth. They're so close. But they still buy into Darwin. See, Jordan Peterson is so obsessed with, I'm getting off on a tangent here. He's so obsessed with the sort of practical psychological world that he just starts with Darwin and doesn't really ever ask himself how the mind and these immaterial archetypes that it entertains and all these things that Jung talked about, how that could come from the brain that Darwin posits as being the foundation of the mind. He doesn't ever do that. He goes, yeah, Darwin, okay, now how, right? So he, like a moment ago I said, Brett Weinstein, they'll never get out of this trap. I mean, Jordan Peterson is going to fight it. He's going to go down swinging his sword, no questions asked. If you don't see the fire in that man's eyes, then you don't know what's at stake in all of this. And he'll go down fighting. I don't know about others, but he won't beat it because he embraces Darwin. Okay? So I hope that Jordan Peterson watches this, because he's going to learn something very freeing, okay? And he's all about freedom, and I am too. Freedom which is impossible if your mind is just your brain, which is another object just governed by all the laws of physics in the world. You can't be free. There's no self then, okay? Anyway. Okay, so here's what I told them. What is the interaction problem? What's the interaction problem? Well, Nick, you just said that a million times. Okay, good. Let's just how can the mind, if it's what Descartes and the Bible, right? If it's what Descartes and his Bible, or Descartes, if it's what all these people that believe this general outlook about the world, this duality, spirit and matter, for flesh and spirit, mind and matter, immaterial and material. If the mind is this immaterial thing, how could it act on anything material in the world? How could my mind cause my nervous system to do things like pick up the cup of coffee? There is no plane on which for them to interact. There is no commonality. There's no property that they share such that there can be a point of contact. So, again, the accusation against Descartes was, dude, you're just kind of skipping over that part. You've got an occult property there, bro. Okay? And they all went, oh, good, now we're done with you, and we're done with the Bible too. All right? Okay. So, you see their beef. You see what the interaction problem is. And then Hobbes and them and all, if you read sort of the compendiums that come along with Descartes' meditations where he works this out, that usually comes along with the interactions with his critics afterwards, and a theme, a motif amongst his critics is this issue. And every philosophy of mind professor, they're all materialist atheists, except for like the really honest ones, like William Lycan, like we've quoted. Any college you go to, they'll always cite this as the fatal problem for Descartes, right? The interaction problem, it just couldn't happen. Can't be that way. And supposing that it is not science, and it's not rationality. It's faith, and that's not what we do here. Don't you know how science works? Okay. You get to laugh at these people. They're jokers. They're not intellects. Okay? They're cheaters. Here's why. Let's take the paradigm example of two physical things interacting that these folks say is like the kind of explanation we're looking for that Descartes didn't satisfy. Whether we're talking about my brain, mind, whatever, causing me to, feeling a sense of thirst and causing me to pick up the coffee, or whether we're talking about particles, or whether we're talking about billiard, the cue ball and the 8-ball, the physical world of three-dimensional objects with mass and that function roughly according to Newton's laws of physics, that world, right? Let's take the paradigm example of that philosophers and theorists always use. It's the billiard table, right? They say, these scoffers, these undergraduate philosophy professors, they say that that's the kind of explanation that we want. That would be a non-occult explanation of how things work, like how the mind works, right? And thus all these theories of mind, functionalism, epiphenomenalism, type token identity theory, all these theories that they come with are attempts to explain how the activity of the brain could be or result in the activity of the mind. Okay? So let's ignore the mind and all that, because that's weird and difficult. And the brain and neurons are tough to, like, what's going on there? It's electricity. Okay, take the beautiful, pristine, thought experimenty example of the billiard table. And we have one ball and another ball. And this ball is acted upon, and it's hit, and it hits that ball, and that ball moves. This is like the standard paradigm case of, ready? the kind of interaction that we understand. Okay? That's non-occult. That's what we're going for. And it's that these religious folks don't have, which is why, at the smallest, at the most academic level of this, we got to reject Descartes. But at the grander societal level, no, we're the Democrats and you're the Republicans, and we're based on science and material, and you're based on faith, and you can't. That's not public, and it's not observable like everything that we say. So you can't bring that into the public square. So all that goes, and thus with it, all natures go, and thus society collapses because we don't know men from women anymore. Did I get ahead of myself? Take the paradigm example of the cue ball hitting the billiard ball. Now they say, I'm telling the students this, right? That this is what we understand, and the need for this kind of clear physical explanation is why conceiving of the mind as being the brain and thus a material thing has so much intellectual virtue over what Descartes was trying to say. All right? It's non-occult. Okay. What happens? Why does one... Open up a can of worms here. Why does one billiard ball move when the other billiard ball hits it? Well, okay, depends on how deep we want to go here, but you might say, well, we have these laws. They both have mass, right? They're both physical objects in the same physical spatial environment. They both have mass, and we know based on Newton that two objects can't occupy the same space at the same time. Okay, good, done. Wait, no, we're not. We could start up even higher. Well, because one hit the other, that's why it moved. And you go, well, why should that cause it to move? Right? Well, I need a deeper explanation. Then we could give the thing about Newton's laws and mass and what object can't, occupy the same space as another at the same time. You say, there, now we're good. Done. Explanation. Non-occult. We're good. But suppose we just went, well, why? What's the reason that two objects can't occupy the same space at the same time, right? You're like, well, that's just a law, right? Oh, you might say, oh, so you're saying it's just so? That's just, and you'd be like, no. There's more. There are actually reasons, and if we want to get into it, we could go down to level 2 of like an object like this is a collection of molecules and atoms which have like these sort of like orbits of electrons and valences, and like there's certain levels of stability, and there's like stable, what do they call them, valence levels. And do you remember this? Okay, at bottom, what we're seeing is electrons repelling one another. Okay, that's what we're seeing when we see two objects interact or something like it, or that's a big piece of it. And you went, oh, okay, got it. So the reason the 8-ball moves when the cue ball hits it is because electrons repel one another. And, the person you're working with here is going to sort of roll their eyes and be like, well, yeah, in so many words, largely, yes. Okay, good. I mean, right, it's probably not the whole story, but it's most of it, right? It's really not important how deep down we go here. Don't worry. I'm just trying to give like an example of the like levels of explanation, because there's something very occult hiding here. You ready? So suppose the person who's inquiring about this goes, well, hold on a second. Why do electrons do that? Now, there's only two options here. There's either some other smaller particle or some other law or both below the level that we're talking about with electrons that explains it, or there's not. But regardless, if we keep pressing an argument like this, we are going to come, because explanation can't go infinitely all the way down. It can't just always be something else that is the reason, right? See, we're going to come to something where we have to say, they do that because that's just what things like that do, and that's why we call them electrons, or, some other thing smaller than, right? In other words, that's just what they do. It can't go on forever. There's going to be a baseline where we reach some sort of explanation where the explanation, the name we give something is almost just bound up with the activity that it exhibits that explains everything else on up the chain. So suppose it's the electrons repelling one another. It's just what they do. Okay. So you're telling me that at the bottom of your explanation that you're saying is this virtuous explanation that doesn't have any occult properties to it, at the bottom of that explanation, you have two things interacting. And your reason, your explanation for how they interact is that's just what things of that sort do. And we build our theory out of that. You realize what you've just done? You've done the exact same thing that Descartes did. You are allowing into your theory an argumentative, I don't mean argumentative in the bad sense, I just mean a theoretical move wherein you are allowed to just stop at a certain point and say, no, there's not a further thing behind this that explains it. These are two components of the world that just behave this way in virtue of what they are. And we've sort of like named them accordingly. That's it. There's nothing further down. You're saying that about electrons or whatever on down we want to, however down we want to go or think we can go. At some point we're going to come to this level. That's the point. At some point we have to come to this level or nothing will ever be explained because the explanation can't go infinitely down, right? The justification, the explanation would never filter upwards then. Do you see? So at some point we're going to have to say, well, that's just what electrons do, man. Okay. But what if Descartes just said, that's just what minds do? They cause bodies to move, or they cause nervous systems to awaken and interact in certain specified ways based on the intention in the mind. Why is that not acceptable? You say, well, it's got to be more complicated than that. How does it do that? No, you can't say that. Because you just said it's perfectly acceptable for an explanation to stop at a point where you've reached the two most basic components of interaction. Now you have to explain to me why a mind and a brain cannot be the two most basic components of interaction. You know what they're going to say? They're going to say, well, we have to have an explanation of how the mind evolved. It's like, I don't buy that. I'm not saying the mind evolved. I'm saying God created minds, right? Man is made in the image of God. He's got a body. He's got a physical system. He's got a nervous system. He's got a brain. And he has a mind, spirit, soul, etc. that is bound up with him. And those are the two most basic, or sometimes people say three, mind, body, spirit, whatever. They're the most basic components of his being. Like your electrons, bruh. And that's just what they do. So if I can't have, that's just what they do, then you can't have, that's just what they do. And it doesn't help for you to say, but mine are material. That's begging the question. This whole thing started because you were trying to explain to me why material explanations were better than material and spiritual explanations. Bro. And my students were like, the fuck? And I said, and this concludes our week of improvised lectures. I hope you feel like you know a little bit more about the philosophy of mind now. And we did some questions, and a couple students came up to me afterward. They were like, God damn, like, I'm not embellishing, because this is freeing in a funny sort of metaphorical way too. You have to understand, so often they are concealing in what they're doing the very thing they're accusing you of. And you don't have to buy into their standards of argumentation. You have to understand what they're doing and not let them have it if they're not letting you have it either. Okay? Hang on, I got an F-35 going over. I assume it's an F-35. Hang on. So, and now here's the wrap up. Well, okay, so this worked out so well. This is amazing. A couple weeks later, I go to my mailbox, and there's an 8.5 by 11. Do I need to tell this? Maybe this is kind of self-aggrandizing. Whatever. I don't fucking care. There's an 8.5 by 11 envelope I'm living in graduate student housing, and I go to open up my mailbox, and there's this award. It's like a not like diploma look, you know what I mean, like an award, like a certificate. It's like an award, and it says the University Housing. What is this? It was like from the University Housing Association. The housing units, the dorms had like surveyed their students about who was like the TA, the graduate student who had like the most effect on their learning. And so many students from this class submitted my name that I won like this University Housing Graduate Teaching Award thing. I didn't even know it existed prior to that. But that's not the point. Here's the funny thing. Here's the funny thing. And look, it's not me. It's the argument. No one ever tells you this. You go through 4 years of undergrad thinking, oh, well, if I accept the religious way of looking at the world, I'm doing something that these scientific people here aren't doing, and I'm adding something to the world that they keep a bit, and they're more neutral than I am, and I need to like keep my faith bottled up, and it's like, fuck that. They're lying to you. So I'm like getting my papers. I'm back to the classroom now, talking to students. A couple students came up to me afterwards, like, "Wow, man!" And I'm like, "What? Right? Because I see every time I talk about this, I get excited because it's so profound." So finish talking to students, and I go up the ascending steps of the lecture hall. There, kind of across the quad from where the philosophy department was. Across the square with the fountain, whatever they call that thing is. And I go out of I leave the lecture hall. I was the last one out, lights out, right? Fingers covered in chalk dust, throat covered in dust chalk, chalk dust. I hate that. That was the thing I hated about teaching, was the dust from the chalk. You'd be like, okay. I go out, and standing there is this guy from my department. This guy's name, this is not important what this guy's name was. He was the guy, a graduate student in my philosophy graduate department. That's what I'm saying. He's standing there. This is the kind of guy. Remember when I talked about arguing on YouTube, and like back when it was all kind of benign, and we were just like chirping about arguments for God's existence or against God's existence? Remember that kind of kid that thought it was like really important to understand how all the arguments for God's existence failed? Fine, they fail. Who cares, right? Why assume that God is the sort of thing whose existence needs to be proved? Can you prove your existence? You can't, right? Can you prove the existence of other people? You can't, right? That's a subject for another show. But this was the kind of kid who like thought that was so. He got like the law. His name was Tim, right? Every guy like this name is Tim. I'm not saying all Tims are like this. Don't mistake the consequent and the antecedent. I'm saying every guy like this seems to be named Tim, right? He's got the long kind of oily hair, glasses, and he wears the flying spaghetti monster T-shirt. You know, he was a little YouTube atheist. That's mean. No, it's true. Right, I used to call these guys the snot-nosed Gestapos, right? Because they just took themselves to be like the police of like your thinking about religion, right? And they were punks, right? Because they would just give bullshit arguments. Anyway, standing outside, I like this guy in a sense. I mean, I liked him enough to buy weed from him. I'm just having fun. He's standing outside the room. And he's like, "Hey, Nick." And I'm like, "What's up, Tim? What's going on? Can I get some weed from you?" All right. I'm like, "Hey, what's going on?" And he's like, "Man, now this is a snot-nosed Gestapo kid. He's the remember if you ran in the worlds that I ran in at this time, you knew like there was this young, motivated by the Daniel Dennetts and the Richard Dawkins and all these people that like just thought that now that someone in that world had told them it was okay to be like, God doesn't exist, fuck religion." And they always use the phrase, people who use the phrase organized religion, you know, the organized religion, right? He's standing outside the room. And he's like, "Hey, man." And I'm like, "Yo." And he's like, "So I got out of my class early." He was teaching too. We all kind of taught in the same building. And I'm like, "Oh, cool." He's like, "Yeah, I've been standing up here. You had the door open. I've been standing just outside in the hallway listening to your lecture." He's like, "What's going on?" I'm like, my guy's sick. I've been doing this all week. And he's like, you know that argument that you gave today about Descartes' interaction problem? And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, I never thought about that before. He goes, that was really interesting because I've never thought about it like that before. You know why he's never thought about it before? Because he was raised in this culture, in this misinformed educational environment where if you go to college and through college and universities and the media, you are taught the story. And that story is a foundation for the socialism you are being pushed towards, which will result in the Marxism that you are being pushed towards. Actually, it's already happened, right? I planned to do this episode like 5 years ago, so it's happening. I was right. The story's false. He'd never thought about it before because he'd been raised to think, oh, the story's just the given. It's just obviously true. And he'd never been given the actual sort of rigorous rudimentary elements of the argument like that before. I'm not saying I'm responsible for it. I didn't come up with that. I'm just saying that's the argument. But you're not taught that because they want to mold and shape you into a person that thinks of yourself as merely a material being. And why they want to do that, I've hinted at this throughout, and I will continue to come towards it. Stick around and find out. Next episode is the second half of the deep dive. See ya.